Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's ruling comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault, and a similar question was requested by viewer Mitchell A. Amy plays Show and Tell, and she's going to put into play a Gristlebrand. Nick wants to put into play a Phantasmal Image, and have that Phantasmal Image be a copy of the Gristlebrand that Amy is putting into play. Is this possible? Okay, so first things first, Nick would have to predict that Amy is putting a creature into play. He doesn't know what card Amy is going to be putting into play at the time when he has to make his choice, so that means that Amy could put something like an Omniscience into play, and then Nick would be looking a little bit foolish. However, it's generally a safe bet that there's at least a very good possibility that you're going to be seeing a creature when someone plays a Show and Tell, so we'll ignore that point for now. Let's take for granted that Nick knows that Amy has a Gristlebrand in her hand, and so it's pretty likely that that's going to be what's going to be in play. So, would it be possible for Nick to put the Phantasmal Image into play as a copy of that Gristlebrand? And it seems like that might be something that could make sense. However, if we look at the Phantasmal Image's ability, we can see that it has a replacement effect. That templating means that it's going to apply immediately before the Phantasmal Image enters the battlefield, and it's going to replace that event with the Phantasmal Image entering the battlefield as a copy of something. So, if we think very carefully about that, we might notice there's a little bit of a problem. At the time when that replacement effect applies, the Phantasmal Image is not yet on the battlefield. And that means that the other thing that's going to be entering the battlefield with Show and Tell with it is also not going to be on the battlefield. Phantasmal Image needs to have something on the battlefield already before the Phantom Image in order for it to be a copy of that creature. Because the Gristlebrand is entering the battlefield at the same time as the Phantasmal Image, it's not going to be on the battlefield in time for the Phantasmal Image to get to copy it. Things would work a little bit differently if Amy and Nick were resolving something like a Eureka or its successor, Hypergenesis. Notice that with these cards, there's a specific definite order in which the creatures enter the battlefield. That would mean that if Amy were to put a Gristlebrand into play with Hypergenesis, then it would be on the battlefield when Nick is deciding whether he should put a Phantasmal Image into play. Because it's going to already be on the battlefield when the Phantasmal Image is entering, that would mean that Nick would be able to have the Phantasmal Image enter the battlefield as a copy of Gristlebrand if it were one of these types of spells putting them into play rather than a Show and Tell. Okay, there's one other advanced note that I wanted to cover here. If you're an astute viewer, you might be wondering something. How is it that the Phantasmal Image can enter the battlefield as a copy of anything at all? Because if we're going to say that the Phantasmal Image's replacement effect applies immediately before it enters the battlefield, well, at that time it's still in Nick's hand. And generally, cards that are in a player's hand are not considered to have any abilities at all, or any other characteristics. So if that's the case, how is it possible for a replacement effect to affect the way that Phantasmal Image enters the battlefield when it's coming into play from a hidden zone like a player's hand, or maybe even from a library? Now, that's a really good question. So good in fact that there's an actual rule that describes exactly how this process works in detail. As you can see here, if an object is entering the battlefield from a hidden zone, such as a player's hand, then there's a specific step in the game where the game gets to look at that object and see if it has any abilities that might affect the move. For example, the replacement effect on Phantasmal Image. Notice that this step still happens before the creature is on the battlefield. And so all that stuff I said in the beginning, where you would have to have some creature that was already on the battlefield to be a legal choice for the creature that you're going to have Phantasmal Image enter as a copy of, that's still true. However, this rule explains why it's possible for something that normally doesn't have any characteristics to have an ability that affects the way that it enters the battlefield. Fortunately for everybody, the answer to this one ended up being pretty much the same as what people probably thought that it would, in that it does get to enter as a copy of something, even if it's not going to be able to enter as a copy of something that enters at the same time as it. It's always nice to know exactly why some of these types of things happen, even if it is a little bit complicated and you do need a little bit of a deep dive into the exact minutiae of what's happening in the game in order to be able to describe it in a technical way. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.